The fire burns low. Pardon me for a moment while I put another log on to take away some of the gloom from outside. The rain has stopped for the moment, but the clouds are only getting darker. My name is Thorkell. Many of you are my friends, but to those of you who do not know me, I am the Tapmaster these many years inside the pub of the Castle Arms Inn here in Castletown. I manage the spirits within a bottle, even as I nightly conjure the spirits from the very essence of these shores and beyond, and chase them off the dark streets on my way home after my duties. I have lived and worked within the shadow of Castle Rushen my entire life, but I have not satisfied myself of the noble, and sometimes not so noble deeds committed within its walls and hidden away by stone and mortar. The many stories of magic and sorcery, of wandering spirits and sightings of monstrous things and monstrous happenings. But the streets are narrow and twisted as of the forgotten tales from this very ancient place. But just as the prodigal son returned home again to be welcomed, these faint stories return home again into twisted folklore and cryptic legends that refuse to die. These stories are part of the very earth now, even as the cold rains from the sea fall upon the land, only to be absorbed and brought up again as purple gulls. One evening, after a brief shower, the Luthier came into my pub for a dram before going back to his home in the north. I had not seen him in some time. His name was Jonathan, the Jack Daniels man, but I knew him as the Luthier. He was a craftsman whose skills were ever in demand, mostly in England though. He vowed never to leave the island again. He would stop in on occasion to Castletown after posting packages to the mainland, where he would not trust these packages to the postman. I asked him to tell me a story when last I saw him, but he only thought to speak of soccer games and terrible crashes during the TT races, for he did not know me very well. And he did not know of my love of the strange, my love of the ancient folklore of this island by the sea. Do you know any folklore? I asked him. Do you know any stories about Luthiers, such as yourself? They tell me there was a time once, now centuries past, when a young man, a harper by trade, wandered these narrow streets and brought his visions of all things good and evil, in music and in songs from his harp, even as a conjurer calls forth serpents from the sea. He then took a sip of his dark whiskey. Yes, he answered. I have heard these stories, and I know of other stories. There are stories about Luthiers that I know, for this craft is very old, and the stories as old as the craft. Hagen, the woodchopper, belongs to our distinct folklore, but there is much more, and many more books could be written. Yes, Hagen may have been the thaumaturge, but there have been many others throughout the centuries, and it is the law that allows this form of sympathetic magic to exist. I could see that he was uncomfortable, but I could not understand why. He looked around to see as if anyone had been listening to our conversation, and when he was satisfied that we were not being observed, he continued, almost like he wanted to speak, but needed to be careful. A great luthier knows the touch of wood. He knows the wood by feel, by the deep grain and texture, even as a lover knows the touch of compliant flesh. The luthier knows this gentle touch, the tactility and the scent of the wood. It knows. This is how the inner properties of the wood are known and judged. A good luthier knows the wood and treats it with love, respect, and the wood remembers. You see, sound is an expression of the quality, the resonance of the wood. A good luthier knows this, but a great luthier knows how the instrument will sound even before it's complete. And with the thoughtful sanding and polishing of the wood, like all things precious, it only becomes more beautiful and pure beneath the hands of a master. There are legends, I started to say. Yes, he answered. The legends are endless as they are varied. We all know the story of Hagen the woodchopper, but there are even more strange tales of the sacred, almost conscious properties of wood, and that certain luthiers have even crafted spirits, as did Hagen, into the very instrument. Are these just stories? I asked. He looked at me for a moment, and I thought he was about to speak. Instead, he picked up his glass and looked for a long drink of whiskey. Surely these are just stories, I repeated. He motioned, and I poured him another dram. It is said that an instrument, a violin crafted in the time of the great Paganini by an apprentice of the gifted luthier Giuseppe Garnieri, and once played by Paganini himself, was so perfect that he was able to anticipate the notes being played upon it. The people were in awe. Many people fainted from pure ecstasy, so visceral was the experience. Frightened by the instrument and claiming that it was trying to possess his hands, Paganini refused to play. He gave it to one of his contemporaries, a man named Ferrer Battaglia, who played the violin on stage to astonished audiences who rubbed their eyes in disbelief. What is less known, however, is that after his last performance, he was never seen again. And when he was eventually found dead in a gutter, he was still holding the violin to his breast, his hands both nearly severed by his own blade, after first cutting his own throat. And there was the famous lute player, a man named Visconti Barini, who so utterly enthralled the ladies that they would undress in his presence and beg to be taken. And there was the famous luthier who varnished the violin he was crafting with the very blood of the musician he was crafting it for. These are forms of sympathetic magic, and mostly highly refined from the early tellings, but there is a variant of the magic that I can attest to, because I have seen it. I looked at him and waited for him to continue. He seemed to be trying to decide whether or not to continue, and looked into my eyes. I could see that I was anxious for him. I was apprenticed to a master luthier when I was a boy. I learned my craft slowly and thoroughly, for my master was indeed a serious craftsman. There are things I was taught, secrets that I hold dearly, and I will never uncover. uncover these secrets to anyone but to my own apprentice, should I ever be fortunate enough to have one. What I can tell you is that sympathetic magic was, and is, part of the craft. And I was taught to use it carefully and wisely. I was taught that there were two types of magic: the law of similarity and the law of contagion. The law of similarity says that like produces like through a process of imitation, or a representation of the thing the magic is being placed upon. This is the mechanism of primitive hunter magic, puppets, and voodoo. I have no interest in this magic. The second form of magic is much more powerful and much more dangerous. This is the law of contagion, action at a distance, and it states that objects brought into contact, even by representation, remain in contact and are able to be acted upon. And in this way, objects acted upon with the voice are acted upon even through time and space. My master, whose name was Thomas, taught me to weave powerful magic into the instruments I handled. He told me to never forget, but also to never alter the incantations that he had painstakingly taught me, that they must be followed to the exact usage and cadence, for it was a formula. The master thought about nothing but perfection, and that music, once captured by the mathematician Pythagoras and formed into perfect mathematical relationships, could be understood as the music of the world, the music of the spheres, the music of life. He also believed, as did Pythagoras, that everything was in motion. The world, the air we breathe, the entire universe was in motion. That this motion was in the form of vibrations. We could come to understand our world through the corresponding relationships of these vibrations, concordant or discordant as they may be. Regularly, I heard him praise the beauty of the perfect fourth, its power and purpose. But it was the perfect fifth which most impressed him. I listened to frequent lectures about its function, its sound, which he considered the pinnacle of beauty, for the violin, the most beautiful of all instruments, is tuned to the perfect fifth. This is why he told me to be vigilant. He never told me the reason for this, but I was confident that he did not speak without justification. Never, never, he repeated, perform this ritual upon an instrument, not first perfectly tuned. For if the instrument is not tuned, it belongs to the devil. This form of magic is of the second type. To the degree with which this form of magic will work is a function of my skill as a craftsman, the quality of the materials I am using, and my ability as a craftsman to perform the ritual with exact skill taught to me by my master. The instrument must be perfectly tuned, and the magic should enhance and integrate itself into the materials, for even as the sound of the instrument is largely determined by the resonance of the wood, so it is that the resonance works in reverse, from the intonation of the incantation, and that the strings vibrate so intricately to capture the accuracy of these intonations. I looked at him with astonishment. His description was utterly bizarre to me, and in truth, I had never heard anything like it before now. My only thought found its way into words before I even had time to consider the prudence of their utterance. Have you ever performed this ritual on an instrument before tuning it? I asked. He looked at me as if he had been struck, His expression changed. I started to apologize, but he held up his hand for me to stop. He looked thoughtfully at his glass, and I quickly poured him a generous dram. You have guessed rightly. I will tell you my story. Then you can judge the prudence of this form of sympathetic magic for yourself. I was still young as an apprentice when I received my first commission from the master, who had taken it from the young musician in the second string section of an important orchestra from Leipzig. I was to craft a violin for his concert tour ending in London. My master had a good reputation. It was not even questioned that the instrument would be built by an apprentice. I worked 13 weeks on the instrument, and the master checked my progress at every stage. When it was time to evoke this ceremonial incantation, the master was there to perform the ritual. There was only one thing that he could not have known, for he never touched the instrument. It was only for me to touch. In my exuberance and excitement, I neglected to completely tune the instrument, even though I knew one string was slightly flat. I allowed the instrument to be blessed, charmed, bewitched. I was silent as he evoked the powerful magic. Never does a day go by which I do not try in some way to atone for my failure to obey the instructions that was so thoroughly presented to me. Every day I pray about it. Every day I cry. Still another day goes by and I cannot atone. I cannot forget. He was becoming more and more agitated as he proceeded. Kept waiting for him to say it, but he would not speak aloud what was in his heart, rending it with bitter tears. I did not want to upset him, even more than he already was. I began to feel awkward, almost guilty in some way for listening to him. As if through some sympathetic magic, he was trying to atone for his sin through me. I poured him another dram, smaller, drained it before looking into my eyes. This was not your fault, I responded to him. Who could blame you if a string was slightly flat? I looked at him with empathy, compassion, because I could see that he was slightly shaken by the memory. Most of my patrons had left by now, for it was getting late. He sat there and looked at me thoughtfully. There was a strange expression on his face, one of disgust, contempt. No, Thorkell, and with hesitation, but with a resolve he could not hold back. You do not understand. My love of music I have learned from my father. He was a great distiller of whiskey, but he also had a passion for music. My father was a humble man, but when he was able to own his own piano, he was proud. I was but a boy at the time, but I remember the sound of his playing and how it filled our small home. I would lay awake in bed and listen to him softly playing. His music was comforting to me, and I would fall asleep listening to the sweet sound. I was proud of my father, and I thought that surely he must be a master musician. Little truth did I know, for he was was neither trained or proficient, but my admiration for him grew each passing year. One day, a friend of mine from school came home to see our wonderful piano. He was studying music, so I waited for him to sing the praises of my father's piano. When he saw it, he looked and said nothing. He sat down and struck a few chords and began to laugh. This piano was not even tuned properly, he sneered. This is terrible. The hammers are dead and there are wolf tones everywhere. I remember that I almost cried. But to me, my father was a hero. I asked him to leave. I ran to my room to wait for my father. When I came home, I told him what my friend had said, and that he was no longer my friend. Do not feel sorry for me, son. Your friend is right. I am not sad. This is all I can afford, and I have learned to be happy with what I have. To your friend, all he could hear was the imperfections of the instrument, but to me, what I hear is the sound inside my head, and that sound is beautiful. We do not need perfection to be happy, Jonathan, for in truth, it does not exist. Music does not come from the perfection of the notes. Music is what happens between the notes. Remember that and take comfort in the slight imperfections of life. Do this and you will be happy. He looked up and I could see torment in his eyes. I could see that he was holding back tears as the memory of his father lingered. Now, do you understand? He said. And that is when I knew. He had purposefully put that instrument out of tune, and now he was being tormented with guilt. That is when Marina, my longtime assistant, walked past with a smile. She was on her way home for the night. "Good night, Thorkell," she said. "Don't forget your umbrella." "Good night, Marina," I answered and returned her smile. Now only a few patrons were left in the pub. I would have to serve them by myself. But for now they seemed content. I looked back to the Luthier, and he continued his story. I saw him perform on the night of his tour. The concert hall was filled with expectant people anticipating that a piece from Wagner's Tristan und Isolde was going to be played. I watched him carefully, for I was proud that my work was being used in such a powerful way. It was during the prelude that I first recognized something was wrong. It was immediately obvious to me, but no one seemed to notice. The rest of the section continued to play as if nothing was wrong. But I could hear it. I could feel it. As if some form of connection existed between the instrument and myself. I could feel the agonizing emotion in the instrument until I was overcome with a visceral pain. I watched him. He was on fire. I could see it. I could feel his overwrought emotion building. He was inside the music, and the music was being vomited out of... No, I don't mean vomited, but it was just too beautiful. I began to cry. What was happening? What was happening to me? I had to escape. had to get away. I had to breathe. Thoughts of death filled my mind. I could not lift out of this terrible and emotional upheaval to which I had succumbed. After leaving the theater, I walked alone back to my hotel through the dark streets, and an icy coldness worked into my body like the creep of death itself. Once back to my hotel room, I drank whiskey until the opium of oblivion set into my blanket of forgetfulness. And I slept. I slept late the next morning. By the time I went down to the restaurant for breakfast and the morning paper, it was almost noon. I took a paper and found a quiet table next to the window. After settling down with my coffee, I opened the paper and gasped at the front page story. He was dead. The musician I saw last night, the man I had crafted an instrument for, was dead. Horrified pedestrians had watched as he jumped from a bridge into the Thames to his death, still clutching his violin. I felt sick. I could not endure the thought of having breakfast. I had killed him. I knew it. And surely, as if I had pushed him into the river. I walked the streets for hours until I was lost, found my way inside of a pub and drank until forgetfulness saved me from myself. And hours later, I ordered a cab to take me back to my hotel. And the next day I went home. He looked up into my face, waiting for the consternation that he was expecting. But I did not speak. Surely this story could not be true. And at last I asked him, "You said this happened when you were very young, but you still call yourself a Luthier. Tell me what happened." "The devil is real," he said suddenly. "I know this, for I have met him. The devil also speaks to us through powerful emotions because the devil understands the power of beauty. By the time I arrived home the next day, the master had heard the news, and he knew the truth of what I had done. But he did not berate me with words. Instead, he ended my apprenticeship and told me there was nothing more he could teach me. Ironically, it has been my guilt and my utter shame that has accounted for my success even to this day. My incantations have now turned to prayers." "Surely you do not blame yourself," I said. "You did not cause the death of that unfortunate man, Jonathan." "I know that magic is real," he said. "I know that it is evil to attempt to alter what cannot be altered. Our fate. No, Thorkell, I have no desire to feel the pain of others, or to feel ecstasy and delirium. These things do not interest me anymore, for I have found a new joy. Joy that I can feel in my very soul. Yes, the devil can speak to the heart, and often we can be fooled by the rapture within, a rapture that cannot be contained. But I have found a new rapture inside of my soul, and I want no more to do with the rapture of the heart. This is why I have moved away from the world of people. But it is my self-loathing, my self-ostracizing that has made me a famous Luthier. So I continue to thrive, though my heart is heavy with regret." I started to pour him another dram, but he refused with a slight wave of his hand. "Thank you for listening to me, Thorkell," he said. "I shall come back to visit you occasionally." "Why don't you let me order your cab?" I said, for I was concerned. He didn't seem to even hear me. Instead, he looked at me, and I could see deep sorrow in his eyes. "Never seek out perfection," he said thoughtfully. "Never seek perfection, for it can only bring madness. But there is something worse, something much worse. And that is to look for perfection and believe that you have found it." He left my pub and I watched him go, but his story had disturbed me deeply, and I could not stop thinking about it. I thought about his words as I walked home through the dark and lonely streets of Castletown after walking up Parliament Lane. Only a slight mist hung in the air, and I did not expect rain until it was long since turned in for the night. Through the narrow and winding streets of cobbled stone and the closely built houses crouching together like phantoms, I walked as I did every night, and I knew that behind these walls the people whispered in the darkness, and children breathed heavily and wrestled with troubled dreams. Dogs whined and curious cats roamed the darkened halls. And that this sound penetrated the walls of the old city. The city was like an instrument, and the resonance of the city was like an aura, a fog. My footsteps thudded softly as I walked along the familiar streets of my home, and the sound, this resonance, was the sound of my home, the music of my life. This music could be made in no other place, for Castletown was itself an instrument, and that my presence as I walked along, lost in thought, was also part of this strange music.